Imagine a woman so full of kindness, so deeply devoted to serving others, that when she died, an entire community wept, refusing to accept her loss. A woman whose faith and generosity were so profound that God used one of his greatest apostles to bring her back from the dead. This is the story of Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, a disciple of Yeshua who lived not for herself, but for the poor, the widows, and the brokenhearted. What was so special about her? Why did God choose to perform a miracle in her life? Stay with us as we uncover the remarkable story of a woman whose faith still inspires believers today. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss powerful biblical stories like this one. In the thriving port city of Joppa, where merchants and travelers brought news from across the world, there lived a woman named Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. Unlike many women of her time, who were often confined to their households, Tabitha was known throughout the city for her extraordinary acts of kindness. She was not a queen, a prophetess, or a political leader. She was a disciple of Yeshua, and her faith was expressed not through words alone, but through the tireless work of her hands. Tabitha spent her days serving the most vulnerable, widows who had lost their husbands, orphans who had no one to care for them, and the poor who had been cast aside by society. With needle and thread, she crafted garments to keep them warm, but her charity went beyond clothing. She provided food, comfort, and encouragement to those who had nothing. Her home was a place of refuge, where the weary could find rest, and the brokenhearted could find hope. What many do not realize is the personal cost of her generosity. In a time when resources were scarce, Tabitha gave without hesitation, trusting that God would provide. Unlike the wealthy who gave from their abundance, she sacrificed what little she had for the sake of others. She understood that the greatest measure of faith was love in action. Her selflessness was not just admired, it was life-changing for those around her. Then, suddenly, tragedy struck. Tabitha fell gravely ill. The very people she had served, the widows, the poor, and the believers in Joppa, could do nothing but watch as she grew weaker. And then, the unthinkable happened. The woman who had been the light of so many lives took her final breath. Her death sent shockwaves through the city. Those she had clothed wept bitterly, holding the garments she had made as sacred memories of her kindness. The community, once full of joy because of her presence, was now heavy with sorrow. But what no one realized in that moment was that God was not done with Tabitha yet. A miracle was coming, one that would shake Joppa to its core. News of Tabitha's passing spread through Joppa like wildfire. The people could scarcely believe it. How could someone so full of life, so devoted to good works, be taken so suddenly? The widows she had clothed wept openly, clutching the garments she had lovingly sewn for them. Many of them had no family, no source of support, and now they had lost the one person who had truly cared for them. Mourning filled the streets. Tabitha was not just a woman of charity, she was a pillar of the community, a beacon of God's love in human form. The poor, the broken, and the forgotten all gathered, not just to grieve, but to remember her kindness. Some spoke of the times she had given them food when they had none. Others of the warmth her handmade garments had brought them in the cold. For many, she had been more than a friend. She had been the hands and feet of Yeshua himself. Her fellow believers were heartbroken, but they also knew that God had worked through Tabitha in ways that could not be forgotten. And so, according to the cultural custom, they washed her body and prepared it for burial. But instead of immediately laying her to rest, they did something unexpected. A decision was made. They had heard that Peter, the great apostle of Yeshua, was nearby in the town of Lydda. If anyone could offer comfort, if anyone could speak words of hope in the face of this terrible loss, it was him. Without delay, 2 men were sent to find him. Their message was urgent. "Please come at once." Acts 9:38. It was a plea of desperation, a last hope in a moment of sorrow. They had seen miracles before. They had heard of the signs and wonders that followed those who walked in the power of the Holy Spirit. And though they did not know what Peter would do, they knew they needed him there. As Tabitha's body lay in the upper room of a home, surrounded by those who loved her, the people waited. Their hearts were heavy with grief, yet somewhere in the depths of their sorrow, a flicker of hope remained. Something was about to happen, something that would prove that even in death, God's power was not limited. The mourning of a city was about to turn into a testimony for the ages. The air in Joppa was thick with sorrow as Peter arrived at the home where Tabitha's body had been placed. The moment he stepped inside, he was met with the tear-streaked faces of widows and friends who had gathered to mourn. They surrounded him, holding up tunics and garments that Tabitha had sewn with her own hands, tangible proof of the love and generosity she had poured into their lives. Their voices trembled as they recounted how she had clothed them, fed them, and treated them like family when no one else would. Peter could feel the weight of their grief, but he also knew the power of the one he served. He had walked with Yeshua. He had seen the dead raised before. And now, standing in this room filled with sorrow, he sensed that God was about to move once again. With quiet determination, Peter did something unexpected. He turned to the mourners and gently asked them all to leave the room. It wasn't an act of coldness, it was faith. He needed to be alone with the presence of God, just as Yeshua had done when he raised Jairus' daughter. As the door closed behind them, the room fell into a sacred silence. Peter knelt beside Tabitha's still body. He prayed. This wasn't just a ritual or a desperate plea. This was a conversation with the Almighty, a request for the same resurrection power that had raised Yeshua from the dead. And then, with unwavering authority, Peter turned to Tabitha and spoke directly to her lifeless form. "Tabitha, arise." A breath, a twitch, and then, in an instant, life surged back into her body. Tabitha's eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused at first, then sat up. The power of God had reversed death itself. Peter reached out his hand, helping her stand. And then, as if the moment weren't already miraculous enough, he called the widows and believers back into the room. When they saw Tabitha alive, standing before them, the room erupted in gasps and cries of joy. The sorrow that had filled the house was shattered by overwhelming awe and celebration. Word spread quickly through Joppa, and as people heard of this miracle, many turned to the Lord in faith. Tabitha had been dead. Now she was alive, and her story would forever be a testimony that with God, even death does not have the final word. Tabitha's resurrection was not just a miracle. It was a declaration of God's power and faithfulness. As she stepped back into the streets of Joppa, people gasped in disbelief. Many had seen her lifeless body with their own eyes, had wept as she was prepared for burial. And yet, here she was, standing tall, her eyes bright with life. News of her return spread like wildfire. The same widows who had mourned her death now ran through the city, telling everyone what had happened. Tabitha is alive. God has raised her from the dead. The people of Joppa, already stirred by the works of Yeshua's disciples, now had undeniable proof of the power of God. Many who had doubted before could no longer deny the truth. The God of Israel had authority even over death. Tabitha did not retreat into a quiet life after her resurrection. Instead, she continued the very work that had defined her before she died. If anything, she was even more determined. The garments she had once made for the poor became symbols of a miracle. The people she had once comforted now sat at her feet, listening to her testimony. And when she spoke, she did not glorify herself, but pointed everyone back to Yeshua, the one who held the keys to life itself. The impact of her miracle rippled through Joppa, drawing countless souls to the faith. The city had witnessed death defeated. They had seen the impossible become reality, and they could not turn away from the truth. Because of Tabitha's resurrection, many believed in the Lord, accepting the message of salvation that Peter and the other disciples preached. Her life became a living testimony, not just of what God had done for her, but of what he could do for anyone who put their trust in him. Her hands, once stilled by death, now worked again, sowing, serving, giving. But this time, with an even greater purpose. Tabitha had been given a second chance at life, and she would use every breath to bring glory to the one who had restored it. Tabitha's story did not end with her resurrection. She became a beacon of faith that echoed beyond the walls of Joppa. Her life, once defined by quiet acts of kindness, was now a living testimony of God's power. People who had once doubted now believed. Those who had seen her lifeless body now saw her vibrant and full of purpose. The miracle had not only restored her life, but had also revived the faith of an entire community. As word of Tabitha's resurrection spread, many flocked to Joppa to witness this wonder for themselves. Some came out of curiosity, but many came in search of hope. If God had the power to bring the dead back to life, then surely he could heal the broken, provide for the needy, and restore the lost. And Tabitha, once again, became a vessel for God's work, not just through her hands that continued to sew garments for the widows, but through the testimony that spilled from her lips. Her legacy extended beyond the miracle itself. She had always been a woman of action, and now her faith and works inspired an entire generation of believers. Her life was proof that serving others was not just an act of kindness, it was an act of faith. Churches in the region grew stronger as many who witnessed her story gave their lives to Yeshua. The believers in Joppa became bolder in their faith, knowing that they served a God who conquered even death. Tabitha's life reminded them that every act of kindness, no matter how small, was seen by God and had the power to transform lives. And so, long after her days on earth had passed, the name of Tabitha remained, a name whispered in gratitude by the widows she had clothed, a name spoken in awe by those who had seen her raised, a name honored by generations of believers who followed her example. Tabitha's story was never about fame or recognition. It was about a servant's heart, a faith that never wavered, and a God who was mighty to save. And her legacy still lives on, inspiring all who choose to walk in the path of love, faith, and unwavering devotion to God. Tabitha's life was proof that love, faith, and service matter in the eyes of God. She was just one woman in a vast world, but her kindness changed lives. And in the end, God honored her faithfulness in a way no one expected. Her story asks us an important question. How are we using our lives to serve others? Are we living in a way that reflects the love of Yeshua? If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs encouragement. And if you want to hear more powerful biblical stories, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more incredible accounts from Scripture that will deepen your faith and draw you closer to God. Until next time, remember, God sees your faithfulness, and He is not finished with you yet.